On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Merle Hassel drove his pickup truck down a county road in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched a John Deere dealership close its doors for the last time. He didn't stop. He didn't wave at the men loading the last of the parts inventory into a flatbed. He just slowed down, looked at the building through the passenger window, and kept driving. He had seen it coming for 3 years. Most people hadn't. Most people, in fact, were still arguing about whether it was really happening right up until the morning the sign came down. Let me tell you about Hardin County in 1987, because you need to understand the world Merle Hassel lived in before you can understand what he spent the next 16 years doing in his shed. Hardin County sits in the north-central part of Iowa, flat and wide and serious about its business. The land there is some of the best in the state. Black soil that runs 4 feet deep in places, bottomland along the Iowa River that floods every few years and comes back richer for it. The farms there weren't small. A family operation in Hardin County in the mid-1980s might run 800 acres. Sometimes 1,200, with equipment lines worth more than most people's houses, and the equipment of choice for most of those families was green. John Deere green. It had been that way since before most of the farmers there were born, and the assumption, the quiet, unexamined assumption, was that it would stay that way until after they were gone. The dealership that closed in March of 1987 had been in Eldora for 31 years. It had opened in 1956, the same year the county's corn yield first broke 80 bushels per acre. It had sold tractors to men who were now in their 60s, and it had sold parts to the sons of those men, and it had been the place where, on a cold January morning when something broke and you needed it fixed before the ground thawed, you drove to, and somebody knew your name before you got through the door. That kind of dealership. The kind that takes a generation to build and about 18 months of farm crisis to destroy. The farm crisis of the 1980s hit Hardin County the way it hit most of the Midwest. Not like a storm, which announces itself, but like a slow leak. Land values that had doubled and tripled through the 1970s started dropping in 1981 and didn't stop for 5 years. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land prices found themselves holding loans they couldn't service on corn that was selling for $2 a bushel. Equipment dealers who had extended credit to those farmers found themselves holding paper that wasn't worth what it said. And one by one, across Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska and Illinois, the dealerships that had anchored small farming communities for 30 years started closing. Some of them quietly, some of them not quietly at all. The Eldora John Deere dealership closed quietly. The owner, a man named Gerald Prescott, whose father had opened the place in 1956, had seen the numbers for 2 years and had made his peace with them before anyone else had to. He liquidated the parts inventory, settled the accounts, and was out of the business by the first week of March. He left a building on the south end of Eldora with a faded outline on the brick wall where the sign had been, and he left about 240 farming families in Hardin County without a dealership within 30 miles. The nearest John Deere dealer after that was in Iowa Falls, which was 22 miles south, and then another one in Marshalltown, which was 35 miles. 22 miles doesn't sound like much until you're trying to get a part for a planter that's sitting in a field in May, and every hour it sits costs you money. 22 miles doesn't sound like much until you've made that drive 6 times in a week because the part they had wasn't the right part, or the part they ordered didn't come in, or the man who knew how to diagnose your particular problem wasn't working that day. Merle Hassel understood this better than most, because Merle Hassel had been paying attention. Let me tell you about Merle because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Merle Hassel was 51 years old in 1987. He had farmed the same 640 acres in Hardin County for 28 years, the same ground his father had broken in the 1940s, and his grandfather had first turned a decade before that. He was not a large man. He was not a loud man. He was the kind of man who, at a county meeting or a co-op gathering, you might not notice for the first hour, and then you'd say something that wasn't quite right about a hydraulic system or a carburetor jet, and he'd say, quietly, one sentence that made you realize he'd been listening to everything and understood it better than anyone else in the room. He had grown up working on equipment because there was no money to pay someone else to work on it. His father had taught him, and his father's father had taught his father, and the knowledge had passed down through the family the way land does, not as a formal inheritance but as a daily practice, something you absorbed because it was always happening around you. By the time Merle was 14, he could rebuild a carburetor. By the time he was 20, he could diagnose an electrical fault by listening to an engine run. By the time he was 30, he had developed the particular kind of mechanical intuition that cannot be taught in a classroom. The ability to hear what a machine is telling you and know not just what is broken, but why it broke and what it will break next if you don't address the underlying cause. He farmed his 640 acres with equipment he maintained himself. He had a 402 John Deere that he'd bought used in 1969 and had rebuilt twice since. He had a 301 that had been his father's, which he kept running with a combination of machined parts, salvaged components, and an understanding of the engine that went beyond what the service manual described. He had a 2-row corn picker from 1958 that he ran every fall, not because it was efficient, but because it worked, and he knew how to fix it when it didn't. His neighbors thought he was eccentric. His wife, Lorraine, thought he was practical. She was right. What Merle had that most people didn't have was a shed. The shed sat behind the machine shop on the north end of his property, and it had started as a place to store parts he'd pulled off equipment before he sold it or traded it in. A spare hydraulic pump here, a set of injectors there, a crate of PTO shafts from a dealer close out in 1974. He hadn't set out to build an inventory. He'd just never been able to throw away a part that still worked, and over 20 years the shed had grown from a storage space into something that, if you knew what you were looking at, was genuinely remarkable. There were drawers of carburetor jets organized by size. There were shelves of gaskets, head gaskets, manifold gaskets, valve cover gaskets, sorted by engine series and wrapped in wax paper to keep them from drying out. There were crates of bearings, bins of seals, a wall of belts organized by length and cross-section. There was a parts washer he'd built himself from a 55-gallon drum and a recirculating pump. There was a lathe, a drill press, a welding setup, and a surface grinder that he'd bought at an auction in 1981 for $40 because nobody else knew what it was. His neighbors knew about the shed in the way that people know about things they've heard mentioned but never fully investigated. They knew Merle had parts. They knew he could fix things. But the shed, to most of them, was background noise, the kind of resource you file away in the back of your mind under probably useful someday, and don't think about again until someday arrives. Someday arrived in the spring of 1987. Let me tell you about the spring of 1987 in Hardin County, because it was the spring that everything Merle Hassel had been quietly doing for 20 years became something the county couldn't ignore. The ground thawed in mid-April that year, which was about normal. The farmers who had gotten their financing in order, which was not all of them, not by a long stretch but enough of them, started preparing to plant. And within the first 2 weeks of field work, the calls started coming to the Iowa Falls dealership. A blown head gasket on a 4230, a cracked injector line on a 6600 combine, a failed hydraulic pump on a 4440 that a man named Burton Kowalski had just finished paying off and could not afford to have sitting idle. The Iowa Falls dealership was doing its best, but it was doing its best for 2 counties now instead of 1, and the parts counter was backed up, and the service bays were full, and the wait for a common gasket set was running 4 to 6 days. 4 to 6 days in April is not an inconvenience. It is a catastrophe. Burton Kowalski was the first one to drive out to Merle's place. He came on a Thursday afternoon, with a blown head gasket from his 4440 in a paper bag and a look on his face that was somewhere between desperate and embarrassed. He'd heard, he said, that Merle sometimes had parts. Did Merle happen to have a head gasket for a 4440? Merle took the gasket out of the bag, looked at it, set it on his workbench, and walked to the shed. He came back 4 minutes later with a head gasket in wax paper, still in the original packaging from a dealer in Waterloo that had closed in 1979. It was the right part. Burton Kowalski stood there for a moment, looking at it like a man who has just been handed something he didn't fully believe existed. "What do I owe you?" Burton asked. "Cost me $6 in 1979, Merle said. "Call it 8. Burton paid him $8 and drove home and had his tractor running by the next morning. And he told his neighbor, and his neighbor told his brother-in-law. And by the second week of May, Merle Hassel's driveway had seen more traffic than it had seen in the previous 5 years combined. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a community discover a resource it didn't know it had? There is a particular quality to that discovery, a mixture of relief and slight embarrassment, the way people feel when they realize the answer to their problem was available all along and they just hadn't thought to ask. That was what happened in Hardin County in the spring of 1987. Farmer after farmer drove down Merle's county road and came up his gravel driveway and stood at the door of his shed and described a problem, and more often than not, Merle either had the part or knew where to get it or could make something that would serve the same function until the right part arrived. He charged fair prices. Not cheap prices, fair ones. He charged what the part had cost him plus a reasonable margin, and for his time he charged what a dealership service department would have charged, which was less than it sounds because he was efficient and he didn't guess. When he opened an engine, he knew what he was going to find before he found it. When he diagnosed a hydraulic problem, he didn't replace parts until he'd identified the cause. He had seen too many farmers spend money on the wrong repair because a shop had guessed and guessed wrong, and he wasn't going to do that to his neighbors. The man who had the most to say about all of this was a dealer from Iowa Falls named Rick Thornton. Let me tell you about Rick Thornton because you need to understand what he represented before you can understand why what happened between him and Merle Hassel mattered. Rick Thornton was 38 years old in 1987, which made him 13 years younger than Merle. He had taken over the Iowa Falls dealership from his father-in-law 4 years earlier and had expanded it. New service bays, a bigger parts counter, a computerized inventory system that he was genuinely proud of and mentioned at every opportunity. He drove a new 3/4-ton pickup and wore a John Deere cap that was always clean, which is a detail that tells you something about a man in farm country. He was not dishonest. He was not cruel. He was a man who had built something and was proud of it, and who understood the world through the lens of that pride, which meant that anything outside his system, anything that didn't go through his dealership, his parts counter, his service department, registered to him as a problem to be corrected rather than a solution to be acknowledged. He had heard about Merle Hassel by June of 1987. He'd heard that farmers in the northern part of the county were getting parts from some old-timer in a shed and having their equipment repaired by someone who wasn't a certified technician and wasn't using new OEM parts, and wasn't, in Rick Thornton's view, operating within any kind of legitimate framework. He drove out to Merle's place on a Saturday morning in June, which was not a social call, though he framed it as one. He found Merle in the shed, rebuilding the carburetor on a neighbor's garden tractor that had nothing to do with anything but that Merle was fixin' because the neighbor was 81 years old and couldn't do it himself. Rick Thornton stood in the door of the shed and looked at the shelves and the drawers and the organized bins and said, with a smile that was meant to be friendly but wasn't quite, "Quite a collection you've got here, Merle." "Been collecting a while," Merle said without looking up. "You know," Rick said, "some of these parts, the older stuff now, might not meet current spec. Customer puts an out-of-spec part on a machine. Something goes wrong. That's a liability question." Merle set down the carburetor and looked at Rick Thornton. "The parts I sell are either new old stock in the original packaging or they're parts I've inspected and measured against spec myself. If you want to tell me which ones don't meet current spec, I'll pull them." Rick Thornton's smile stayed in place, but it had gotten smaller. "I'm just saying there's a reason people go to a certified dealer." "There was a reason," Merle said. "Gerald Prescott closed in March." The silence that followed that sentence lasted about 4 seconds. Rick Thornton looked around the shed one more time, said something about stopping by again sometime, and left. He drove back to Iowa Falls and told his service manager that some old farmer up in the north part of the county was playing mechanic out of his barn, and that it probably wouldn't amount to much. He was wrong about that. Let me tell you about what Merle Hassel's shed became over the 16 years that followed, because the story doesn't start in 1987, and it doesn't end there either. What happened was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things announce themselves. It was quiet and incremental and built on repetition. A farmer came with a problem. Merle solved it. The farmer came back with the next problem. Merle solved that one too. Word traveled the way word travels in a county of a few hundred farms, not through advertising or announcement, but through the particular network of men and women who talk at the grain elevator and the co-op and the cafe on the south end of Eldora, where the coffee was bad, but the information was good. By 1989, Merle had a logbook, not because he'd set out to keep one, but because he'd started forgetting which neighbor's tractor had which quirk, and a logbook solved that problem. He wrote down every machine he worked on, the make, the model, the year, the serial number, the problem, the repair, the parts used, the date. By 1995, he had 4 logbooks, each one filled front to back in his careful, cramped handwriting. Those logbooks contained the maintenance history of a significant fraction of the working farm equipment in the northern half of Hardin County. There was no computer system in the world that held what those 4 books held, because what they held wasn't just data. It was pattern recognition accumulated over 8 years of working on the same machines year after year, and learning what they did and what they were going to do. He expanded the shed twice. The first time in 1991, when he added a lean-to on the east side to house a larger parts inventory. The second time in 1994, when he enclosed the lean-to and added a second workbench and a parts cleaning tank large enough to handle tractor heads. He bought a better lathe. He bought a bore gauge set that cost him more than he'd paid for his first pickup truck. He learned, from a machinist in Marshalltown who had retired from a manufacturing plant, how to sleeve a worn cylinder bore, a skill that let him rebuild engine blocks that a dealership would have told a farmer to replace entirely. The farmers who came to Merle came because he was close, because he was fair, and because he was right. Not usually right. Right. In 16 years of working on farm equipment in that shed, Merle Hassel misdiagnosed a problem exactly twice that he would later acknowledge, and both times he caught the error before the farmer left the property. His neighbors stopped thinking of him as eccentric. They started thinking of him as essential. Rick Thornton, for his part, had not stopped thinking about Merle Hassel. He thought about him every time a customer from the north part of the county mentioned they'd already tried to get the repair done locally. He thought about him when his parts counter ran a report showing that certain part numbers, the ones most commonly needed for the older equipment that Hardin County farmers were holding on to because they couldn't afford to replace it, were moving slowly because someone else was supplying them. He thought about him in 1992 when he drove past Merle's property on the way to a farm call and saw 3 pickups parked in the driveway and a 4th one turning in from the county road. He stopped in that time. He told himself he was being neighborly. He walked into the shed and found Merle explaining to a young farmer named Dale Johansson why his 402O was burning oil on the right side and not the left, and what that pattern of failure meant about the condition of the valve guides, and what it would cost to address it versus what it would cost to ignore it. Merle was using a small flashlight and a mirror to show Dale exactly what he was looking at, and Dale was leaning in over the engine with the focused attention of a man who is learning something he knows he needs to know. Rick Thornton stood in the door for a moment. Then he said, "You know, Merle, if that machine needs a valve job, you'd be better off bringing it to our service department. We've got the equipment." Merle didn't look up from the engine. "I've got the equipment. Certified technicians, I've got the knowledge." Rick Thornton left again. He told his service manager that the old farmer was getting worse, and that somebody ought to talk to him about licensing and liability, and his service manager nodded, and they moved on to other things, and nothing came of it. Because there was nothing to come of it. Merle wasn't operating a business in any formal sense. He was a farmer helping his neighbors, and in Hardin County in 1992, there was no law against that and no appetite to create one. The years went on. The logbooks filled. The shed stayed organized in Merle's particular system, which looked like chaos to anyone who hadn't spent time in it, but was in fact as logical as a library. Parts grouped by machine series, then by system, then by failure mode, with the most commonly needed items closest to the door. Lorraine brought him lunch in the shed on the days he was busy with a neighbor's equipment, and she kept a separate notebook of her own. Who had come, what they'd brought, whether they'd paid. Because Merle's logbooks tracked the machines but not the money, and somebody had to track the money. In the fall of 1998, a man named Emmett Lindgren drove out from Iowa Falls to talk to Merle. Emmett was the county extension agent, and he had been hearing about Merle for years and had finally decided to see the operation for himself. He spent 2 hours in the shed, asking questions and looking at the logbooks and examining the parts inventory, and at the end of 2 hours he sat down on a stool and said, "Do you know what you have here?" "Parts," Merle said. "You have the service history of about half the farm equipment in this county," Emmett said. "You know what the dealerships would pay for that?" "They'd have to pay a lot," Merle said, "because I'm not selling it." Emmett Lindgren wrote a piece about Merle in the County Extension newsletter that fall, a careful, measured piece that described what Merle had built without making it sound like something it wasn't. He called it a community resource and described the logbooks and the parts inventory and the skills Merle had accumulated and shared over 11 years. The piece ran in October of 1998 and was read by most of the farming families in Hardin County and by Rick Thornton, who read it twice and then set it down on his desk and sat there for a while without saying anything. Let me tell you about what Rick Thornton was dealing with in 1998, because this is where the two halves of this story start to come together. The Iowa Falls dealership had been under pressure for several years. The farm crisis of the 1980s had thinned the customer base, and the consolidation that followed, smaller farms absorbed into larger operations, fewer families making equipment decisions, had changed the nature of the business. The large operations wanted fleet pricing and dedicated service contracts and relationships with regional dealerships that could support multiple locations. The small and medium operations that Rick Thornton had built his business on were fewer and older and more likely, now, to keep equipment running longer rather than buy new. The new equipment market was softer than it had been. The service and parts business was where the margins were, and in the northern part of the county, a significant portion of that business had been going to a retired farmer's shed for 11 years. Rick Thornton had expanded his service department in 1995. He had added 2 service bays and hired 2 additional technicians, and invested in a diagnostic computer system that cost him $40,000, and was, he believed, the future of equipment service. The system could read fault codes from any John Deere machine built after 1990. It was impressive technology. It was.